Well, I want to start by thanking everyone for being here. We're delighted to do this forum and to be able to promote Michael's new book, No Bosses. Start with some introductions. My name is Cooper Sperling, and I'll be chairing this panel. I'm a writer, artist, organizer, and student at Parsons School of Design at the New School in New York City. I'm a network member at Utopia, Foundation for a Participatory Society, and an occasional contributor to ZNet. And I am in the middle, and hopefully, if this is right, to all of your right, this is Micheal, who is an organizer, publisher, teacher, and author of over 20 books and hundreds of articles. He co-founded South End Press, Z Magazine, the Z Media Institute, ZNet, various other projects, and works full-time for Z Communications. He is the author, with Rob now, of the economic vision named Participatory Economics. He is also the author of a new book called No Bosses, which, as I said, is the subject of our panel discussion today. Also joining us is Alexandria Shaner, who is a sailor, writer, organizer, and activist. She is an instructor at the School for Social and Cultural Change, a contributor to ZNet, and active with the Climate Reality Project, Save Our Sharks, and Real Utopia Foundation for a Participatory Society. She, like all of us, are advocates for a participatory society. So, as I said, the topic of this panel is specifically No Bosses, A New Economy for a Better World by Micheal Albert, but more broadly about participatory economics at large. So, to briefly introduce the subject, here's a quote from the website that is used to promote Michael's new book, nobossesbook.com. It says, "No Bosses says we conceive and then organize to win a new economy. It says we conceive and then win new institutions for how we work, for how we consume, and for how allocation occurs. It says we eliminate class rule. It says we ensure that economics respects and advances ecological, social, and personal well-being. This vision offered by No Bosses is called participatory economics." So, to start us off, Micheal, why don't you tell us about the logic of No Bosses and how you and Robin arrived at participatory economics in the first place?
Sure. Hello, folks. It's a pleasure to be here and to, you know, talk with you, I hope, as things go along. The the book is about having no bosses. When Robin and I started into this stuff, it was a long, long time ago, and we were very aggressively anti-capitalist, anti-racist, anti-sexist, anti-authoritarian, and so on. And we would constantly ask, well, what do you want? And we began to feel like trying to answer that question was a valuable pursuit, and so we did. And so I can try and describe what the book has. I'll try and do it in a way that follows how you asked for logic, that follows how we actually came to the vision that the book advocates. So the introduction to the book basically is just a very aggressive discussion of what's wrong in contemporary society and the need for vision to help orient and provide hope and overcome cynicism and provide some grounding in the future for where it is we want to go. And then there's a chapter on values, and that follows logically the way that, in fact, we thought about the issue. We thought it made sense to try and figure out, well, what are our values, and how does an economy affect them? We want an economy that propels them, that makes them not only possible, but even advances them. And the values we came up with were self-management. People should have a say in the decisions that affect them in proportion to the degree they're affected, to the extent possible. Solidarity, an economy should cause us to have empathy and social relations, feelings with one another, and to relate. Diversity, an economy should promote diverse relations. It should not put all its eggs in one basket. It should relate in that fashion. And equity. It should apportion things sensibly fairly among people. And that last value, solidarity and diversity, are so straightforward. I'm not even talking about them at all. And the idea of equity for us, as we thought about it, it was that people shouldn't be remunerated because they have property. People shouldn't be remunerated because they have the power to take it, a sort of a thug's economy. But also, people shouldn't be remunerated because they happen to be lucky in the genetic lottery. They happen to be born with an incredibly mellifluous, I don't even know the word, voice, or they happen to be born with great reflexes and height and whatever attributes lend themselves to producing a lot, providing a lot for society. You shouldn't get income for that. So we decided what you should get income for was how long you work, how hard you work, and the onerousness of the conditions under which you work, as long as what you're doing is socially valued. And so then we started thinking about, okay, what's the deal with capitalism and with finding a alternative to it? Well, the first thing you have to find an alternative to is the thing that capitalism is named for, which is people owning the means of production. If you have people owning the means of production, you have two immediate problems for the values that I was just talking about. Right off, without going into any great analysis, the owners control what they own. If they control the means of production, then they control the workplace and they control the circumstances and the relations under which workers work. That violates self-management. And then the next thing that follows directly is that they get income for the output of the workplace. In essence, they get profits, and that violates equity. So we immediately had to sort of address that issue. And what we came up with was if we're going to have self-management, then the people who are going to self-manage have to have a venue, a mechanism in which they sort of do that. And that's called workers and consumers self-managing councils. It has a long heritage. It comes from leftists in the past, to be sure. For instance, council communists advocated it. Many anarchists advocated it. And then the fact that you want to have workers and consumers self-managing councils means that you want people who work to be making the decisions about the workplace. Well, can people do that? Under what circumstances can people do that? What is it that causes people to not be able to do that? So part of the answer is obviously prior training, but there's a more important part for the economy, which is that we began to think about the workplace division of labor that we have. And we called it the corporate division of labor. And it's a situation in which about 20% of the workforce does empowering, interesting work that gives them skills, that gives them confidence, that gives them ties to others, that puts them in proximity of decisions. It empowers them. And 80% do a set of tasks in their jobs which have the opposite impact. It sort of atomizes their relations, it reduces the skills, it diminishes their awareness and their knowledge of what's going on, it isolates them from decision-making circumstances, it disempowers them. And if you have that, well, then once again, you've violated those values that we said we wanted to try and fulfill. I mean, self-evidently, you've got 20% dominating 80%, there goes solidarity. There goes equity because the 20% will have more income, and there goes self-management because the 80% will be subordinate. So if that division of labor is this basic problem, and we think it is, and we thought it was, and we thought it yields what we called a coordinator class above a working class. Other people give it other names, doesn't matter what we call it. It's an empowered group above a disempowered group. Then there arises the question, what do you do about that? And when we thought about it, we came to the conclusion that you had to change. I mean, it's not rocket science. If there's a situation in which the tasks that you do at work are fundamentally causing you to to have different attributes such that 20% are ruling 80%, well, then you have to change the allocation of those tasks. So we thought of something called balanced job complexes, in which basically you're doing a mix of tasks in your work that is comparably empowering to the mix of tasks that other people are doing. So in essence, work is preparing everybody rather than a few to play a participating role in the decisions that affect their lives. So once you have that, you have to start thinking about remuneration. And so we did. And when we thought about remuneration, again, it wasn't that complicated. We don't want this gigantic gaps in income, but what does that arise from? Well, on the one hand, it arises from property. We already got rid of that. On the other hand, it might arise from power differentials, because bargaining power is critical, at least in our economy, to determining who gets what. So we don't want bargaining power to be a factor in remuneration, just like we don't want property to be a factor in remuneration. And we also decided, and this might be more controversial, maybe somebody will ask about it, that we didn't want the fact that you could sing like Adele or shoot baskets like LeBron James or think like Chomsky or whatever to play a role in what your income is. We wanted it to be for duration, intensity, and onerousness of socially valued work. And then this brought us, you can see it's not that difficult. It really isn't. This brought us to, well, how does it hang together? And hanging together in an economy is, how do the workers' councils and the consumers' councils arrive at a plan, a tasks, actual, how many bicycles are we going to produce? How many apples are going to be grown this season? How many cars are going to be made, or electric vehicles, or whatever it turns out to be? And how is the materials for that and the resources for that and the labor for that going to wind up where it needs to be in order for it to happen? And how is all of that is produced going to match up with what people want and with what their budgets, which are based on their income, which is based on duration, intensity, and onerousness of their contribution to output, unless they can't work, in which case they just get a full income. How is all that going to mesh together and going to match up? And what we came up for that was that it's allocation. And some economies do allocation by what's called central planning. It's basically central planners, workers, down go orders, up goes some information, down go orders, up goes some information, down goes orders, up comes obedience. That's central planning. That's the essence of central planning. There's more to it in detail, but that's the essence of it. And the other possible allocation system that has existed, in which current economists said were the only two, was markets. And that's a situation in which buyers and sellers essentially try to fleece each other. You try to, sell dear, buy cheap and sell dear. And it's a zero-sum game in which the advantage of one comes to the disadvantage of the other. And there's competition, and there's, this is a longer discussion, but there are diverse problems associated with each of these two forms of allocation. They produce that coordinator class, working class division. Maybe somebody will ask about that. They create inequality, inequity. They violate that. They completely demolish self-management. In other words, if we hold those values dear, if we really mean that we want those values to be met, then we have a problem. We have to come up with something instead of markets and central planning. And this is exactly the way this scenario, I suppose you could call it, progressed. And so then we worked on, well, how do we have workers and consumers councils that are self-managing, right? Engage in a process which arrives at inputs and outputs, doesn't violate our values. And that's called participatory planning. And, it has many features, but it's not complicated. You can think of it as cooperative negotiation by workers and consumers of inputs and outputs. And then within workplaces and within neighborhoods, workers and consumers councils are engaging in that process, and they're also determining their own circumstances. And so at that point, in the book, and actually it came before all of it in life, I suppose you could say, it leads to, well, okay, if that's what an economic vision looks like, and obviously I've only very briefly characterized it, what about other sides of life? And indeed, the book does then address, to an extent, much less because it's a book about economic vision, what might be desirable and worthy for household circumstances, upbringing, nurturance, sexuality, culture, community relations, and polity, legislation, adjudication. What are some of the features that those might have to be true to the same set of values, essentially? And how would they mesh with an economy, and how would the economy affect them? And then when you get there, you either are doubtful, actually you should be, or you're already an advocate. If you're not already an advocate, maybe you improve it and then become an advocate, or maybe you become an advocate. But if you're concerned about, and regrettably, and I hate apocalyptic politics, but nowadays you can't deny it. If you're concerned about the fact that we live in a suicide machine, and that society is at peril not just for incredible injustice, which it's always had, and not just for incredible violations of human well-being and dignity, but even of survival. If that concerns us, then it behooves us to figure out how to attain a better economy. That's what the book is titled. No Bosses. I guess it's a new economy for a better world. I'm not even sure what the title is. I think that's the title. And if one feels that way, the issue that arises is, of course, strategy. How do we get from where we are to where we want to be? And that's where I leave off.
Yeah, this is a great transition. Alexandria, you are here today representing Real Utopia, Foundation for a Participatory Society. So I would like to ask you, to add to this question about the immediate implications of the Paracon vision and how that might manifest itself in our strategies today and, our organizing.
Great, absolutely. First, hello, everybody. Thank you to the audience for being here with us and to the organizers for putting on this event. So this question about whether participatory economics is a purely academic subject, or if and how this kind of vision matters in real life applications today, that's actually the perfect reason to talk about Real Utopia. Vision is really the foundation of Real Utopia, and strategic activism is what we are trying to do. So to start off, what is Real Utopia? I put a link to our website in the chat if anyone is curious later on to check it out, realutopia.org. We're a diverse group of activists, organizers, and just concerned citizens who all share a vision about participatory society, for participatory society. And as Micheal said, participatory society stemming from participatory economics is just a way of describing the broader spheres of life beyond the economic sphere and applying those same participatory values. So our goal in coming together via Real Utopia is, as I said, strategic activism. And what do I mean by that? The simplest way that we describe it at Real Utopia is what we call the 4 C's. So first C is consciousness raising, then commitment building, followed by contestation and construction. So 4 C's, easy to remember, but that's pretty much a simplified version of all the things that we're trying to do. So to start with, the first 2, consciousness raising and commitment building, what do I mean by that? It can be any way of raising awareness and commitment for laying foundations for change. This might be organizing educational and skill building programs, participating in panels like this one, hosting open forums for discussion, debate, mutual aid, various forms of collaboration, and then even just getting to know the other activists and enthusiasts that are interested in this kind of stuff. So network building. Moving on from the first two, then you have contestation. What I mean by that is contesting institutions, whether it be various forms of protests, strikes, writing, or any other actions. And then, of course, construction. And here's where we come back to vision again. We want to provide opportunities, make space, and give support for experimenting and building these new ideas and institutions. Our philosophy really is, why should we just try and advocate for alternative theories and not actually try and implement them today, or at least to experiment and implement parts of them now, wherever and however we can. So we really take this concept of planting the seeds of the future in the present quite seriously.
Getting a little bit more into some of the specific concrete ways about, you know, how real utopia and participatory activists are transforming work and economic norms. Would you like to speak a little bit on that and maybe give some examples about what's going on?
Sure. There are many examples of real utopia members doing participatory experiments and projects. Let's start with something really practical on the road to participatory economics. So Real Utopia has a few members involved in participatory budgeting in various communities around the world, and then also more generally advising and advocating for participatory budgeting. This is going on in Ireland, Slovenia, Mexico, Venezuela, Canada, the US, and I'm sure more places that haven't come across my attention as yet. Another real-world, real-time example, I can call out one of our network members, Paul Burrows from Canada. He has a really long history of involvement with the Autonomous Zone in Winnipeg, which is famous for its cooperative organizations and businesses, which operate on participatory values and use participatory organization principles as best they can, even though they live in a capitalist country. So principles like balanced work, participatory self-management, remuneration norms, collective ownership, all can be implemented pretty much wherever you are. Micheal is another great example here with us today. He's co-founder of South End Press and ZNet, both which have operated on participatory values and kind of pioneered some participatory systems, experimenting with, again, balanced work, equitable remuneration, self-management, all these things that we preach, we try and put into practice. There's also projects around the globe participating in experiments outside specifically of the economic realm, like collective living, collective care, governance, work arrangements that all try and uphold these participatory values while still living in systems which don't uphold those values. We have many members who are artistic, enjoy writing, music, other forms of being creative. So Real Utopia also kind of functions as an informal creative collective, I guess you could say, where we can share things that we're writing or creating and get feedback and promote each other's work, help each other get published, and basically just help advocate for this vision that we share. Let's see, we have a member today who was just hosting the Zapatista delegation in Europe. So I know I can speak on behalf of most of the other RU members that we're all really excited to hear back from him and learn how that went and just share in that experience. There's so many examples. I don't want to become boring by just listing them off endlessly. I think the best thing you can do is just check out realutopia.org, start to get familiar with some of these projects, join if you're interested, get to know the network members, and also start gaining some inspiration and support for your own projects that you may have been thinking about or have already started. Last, I think there's one more really important example that I should not forget. Real Utopia itself operates on participatory values as best we can, like the internal processes that we've created, assessing how they stack up to our values of solidarity, equity, diversity, self-management, efficiency, ecology, and internationalism. So again, if we're promoting these ideas for society at large, we're doing our best to try and build our organization to function around these values and gain those benefits today, and also do the work of refining and experimenting as we go. Before I wrap up this little introduction of Real Utopia, there's one more important point that Micheal brings up in No Bosses that he's mentioned, is that participatory economics is going to be the best iteration of itself within a larger participatory society. So in fact, from the Real Utopia side, we have to remember that in order to transform and build a better world, to do this strategic activism, we need to address all the societal spheres, not just the economy. So we need to consider how to achieve diverse examples of vision leading to experimentation across projects that come up against feminism, intercommunalism, internationalism, anti-authoritarianism, projects around education, environmentalism, to really make our transition complete. I guess I'll finish off by just coming back to why vision matters in the first place. This is why vision matters. We need to first identify the values around which we want to build democratizing work and a better world in general. And then we can think, debate, experiment, and refine those ideas as we try and put them into practice today, and we advocate for putting them into wider practice tomorrow. So vision is important in that it's both our inspiration and then our guide as we do the work that we need from day to day. So we, of course, can't do it alone. Real Utopia was really created and continues to develop to become a network that is bringing together people who are interested in participatory theory and vision, and people who are maybe just curious, seasoned activists like Micheal, and allow them to come together to do these projects and create the world that we're all talking about today.
All right. Well, thank you, Alexandria. Thank you, Micheal, for the wonderful explanations of each. And it's clear. It was clear to me at least that the two go really hand in hand. This sort of vision-based strategy, and then the organization and the systems to kind of give that some weight. So we spoke briefly about participatory economics and then also about Real Utopia. So at this point, we welcome any questions about either, really, or about participatory society at large. You see, we have a couple questions. I don't know if anyone else except for me can see them, but we'll start from the bottom. Here we go. The first question is the empowered group really deserving of being called a class? How does it relate to Marxism and Leninism? Micheal, you want to take this one on?
Sure. What's a class? I mean, what is anything that you give a label to? It depends upon what you decide. The label class makes sense for a group that, by virtue of the economy, by virtue of the way the economy is organized, has shared interests, and it comes into opposition to other groups. So the group that we're talking about here is called the coordinator class, and it's a class between labor and capital, meaning capital owns the means of production. Labor does work in circumstances that are disempowering. The coordinator class does work in circumstances that are empowering. Well, is that really important enough to call a class? Farmers do work outdoors on farms. That distinguishes them from other people, but we don't call that a separate class. people who produce cars instead of violin, you know. In other words, there are thousands and thousands of distinctions that you can make among economic actors. Why choose to call one a class? Well, the reason I think you do that in this particular case is because not only is this group important under capitalism because it comes into conflict with workers below and owners above, but in particular, and it comes to the second part of the question, because this group can become the new ruling class. So the thing that has been called socialism, socialism in the 20th century, sometimes it's called state capitalism, sometimes it's called bureaucratized socialism, the thing, say, that was in the Soviet Union, for example. I don't think these names are very helpful. I think what is helpful to realize that in that structure, central planning, a corporate division of labor, if you go into the firms in those systems, they have the same division of labor that our firms have. They just don't have an owner at the top. So if you look at them, there's a group of about 20%, the people who are between labor and capitalism, who now are not gone. They are not just merged together with those who were below. Instead, they become a new ruling class. And if a group not only has its own interests and not only, you know, has behaviors which help to explain the way things work in the existing system, capitalism, but can become a ruling class, well, then I think it behooves us to keep our eyes on it, you know, to pay attention to it, to be alert to that reality, and to avoiding having our project getting beyond capitalism, leading to out with the old boss, in with the new boss, out with the owners, in with the coordinators. And so it makes sense to me, yes, to call it a class. What about Marxism and Leninism? Well, it means that there's a change from Marxism. And the change from Marxism, say in the RU perspective, has two big components. One is elevating attention to race and gender and sexuality and power, authority, to the same basic plane of fundamentally important that economics occupies for the Marxists. And the second big change, and many Marxists acknowledge that change and relate to that change and try to incorporate it into the framework that they're using as Marxists. But the second one is changing the definition and changing the approach to class. Instead of class being only a function of ownership, now it's a function of whatever demarcates employees, working people who work, into separate groups that have opposed interests, especially if there's the possibility of becoming a ruling class. And so that's a distinction from Marxism. As far as Leninism, at the risk of perhaps irritating some people or horrifying some people, I think that Leninism is the ideology of the coordinator class. If Marx tells us that if you want to, this is one of the brilliancies that exists in Marx's writings, if you become familiar with them, he tells us that if we want to understand a perspective, a worldview, the views that are being put forward, especially by a group, by a class, by a group, or by a movement, we should look at who they benefit. We shouldn't look at how they describe themselves. We shouldn't look at what they say about themselves. We shouldn't even look at what they say they want to get. We should look at what it yields, and we should look at whether there's a significant group that benefits. And I think Leninism yields coordinator class rising to ruling status in the economy. And therefore, even though there are many, many Leninists who want full participation, classlessness, a real revolution in all dimensions of life, even though there are many Leninists who want that, the views that they subscribe to regrettably tend to subvert that desire once in action. They have every single time that they've risen to power in society.
Alexandra, you want to chime in?
Sure. Yeah. I completely agree with everything Michael said, and I would just offer to maybe put it in a context in a little bit different words, instead of speaking about why do we need to call the coordinator class a class at all, and how does that compare to Marxism or Leninism or anything that students of economics and politics might study. For anyone who might be listening, to understand this super simply, to me, the difference is when a group of people become systemically empowered or disempowered or exploited or exploiter. So the coordinator example, we can see through many socialist examples in history, and even all of you can just see in your own life, examples where this is a systemic issue. That's why it needs a separate designation and it needs our attention. So I'll give an example that anyone could understand. If you've ever been a member of a book club, if you've had jury duty, if you've been a student in a classroom, you will very often, almost always, experience that even if you set out to be egalitarian, there's no hierarchy, there's no boss. Take the jury group, for example. There will emerge most likely about 20% of the participants who are dominant and about 80% who are either submissive, quiet, uninterested, or feel that they're just not involved. And I don't think you can just chuck this up to, well, that's human nature. 20% of us are just better or naturally more empowered than 80% of us. I think it's systemic. It follows that if you have a monopoly on empowering work, you will then get a monopoly of empowered people. In No Bosses, Michael talks about that while in previous socialist ideologies and experiments, we balanced who owns what, who gets what, but we forgot to balance who does what. And by balancing work, by balancing the job complex, we end this systemic issue where there is an imbalance of empowerment.
Should we do a little more on this? Maybe it's worth it.
Yeah, we certainly have the time.
It's often the case that workers in crises, you don't even have to look at, say, the Bolshevik Revolution or something like that. In Argentina, there was an economic crisis about 20 years ago, and many factories became dysfunctional in terms of profits, and owners punted, they left. And by and large, what we call the coordinator class, the empowered workers, the engineers, the lawyers, the financial officers, they left too, because they thought without the owner, and this is doomed, so I got to go get work someplace else. The workers had no place to go. They took over the factories, and they instituted, out of their own inclinations, a new approach. And the new approach, typically, in case after case, involved the formation of a council, a workers' council, called a workers' assembly if you want to. The equalization or near equalization of incomes. In some cases, it was literally a change to income for how long you work, how hard you work, and the onerousness of the conditions under which you work. And they instituted a kind of self-management. Some cases it was real self-management. Some cases it didn't go quite that far. It was democracy. But what happened is that over a period of months, and I was in a meeting of about 50 such representatives from such factories, such workplaces, and they were describing their circumstances, and it got pretty depressing, because one after another at the beginning, at the outset of the meeting, was saying how things were devolving, how things were returning to the way they were, how it was alienated again, and income distribution was widening again, and some people were dominating. And they all thought that, as one of them said, I never thought I would say, I just couldn't imagine I would ever say that Margaret Thatcher was right. There is no alternative. But maybe Margaret Thatcher was right. Maybe there is no alternative. After all, we took over. We booted the owner out, or actually we didn't have to. They ran away. And the manager, who was such a pain in the ass, he went too, and so on. and we made things more equitable, and we created a council that we were all in, and we all had the same rights, and it's all going to hell. And so then we talked about it. And this is what an institution is. This is what reveals what an institution is. They made those changes, but they kept the old division of labor. And in keeping the old division of labor, it meant that somebody became the new finance officer, somebody became the new manager, somebody filled those slots. And I asked them whether, did you keep that? And to them, the question was stupid, right? It sounded stupid, and I understand that. It's not stupid that it sounded stupid. It's natural that it sounded stupid, because it sounded like I was asking them whether or not they still had lunch breaks, they still had to eat. They thought it was inevitable. They thought, look, it's the only way you can get things done. You have to do it. You have to have somebody who does those jobs. And because they did it, those people began to view themselves as superior. Those people had the power and the knowledge in order to begin to direct the flow of events. And slowly over time, as they described, all the old crap kept coming back. And, so we talked about it in that way. But the point is here is that there's something called the corporate division of labor. And if you have that, it has effects. It affects the outcomes that are possible. It constrains what's possible. And it's the same thing for, say, private ownership. If you have private ownership, it has implications, no matter what people's desires are, unless they overthrow it. And the same thing was true of the corporate division of labor, and it's true of markets and central planning, which is why we come to this whole new thing. And just as a sidebar, if one is thinking about, okay, what's a vision for, sexuality and bringing up children and family life, or what's a vision for culture and religion, or what's a vision for political systems, same questions arise. What institutions, what structures literally produce by their intrinsic attributes the things that we want to get beyond? That's what we have to replace, right? Whatever it is. And to give a stark example of it, in the late 1960s, very early 1970s, women asked this question about family life and the origins of sexism. And some of them began to think, I think quite smartly, that the problem, or a very significant institutional problem, was not just marriage, but that men father and women mother. And that those two roles, and fulfilling those two roles, intrinsically produces a division of labor and a set of attitudes which then breed sexism in the children who are cared for in that context. I'm trying to get across the way of thinking that leads to, a vision instead of the crap that we endure.
Wonderful. Sticking to kind of questions about Paracon in general, we have one from Tom Walker about leisure. So he asks, should leisure be dealt with as a benefit in a new economy, or should it be a core organizational principle? Michael, if you want to touch on that.
I'm not sure what he means by a core organizational principle, but I can describe how it's dealt with. Remember I said that remuneration, so that's basically how much income you get, which is basically your share of the social product. That's what income is, right? It's a claim on social product. So we said that was what? That was a function of how long you work, how hard you work, and the onerousness of the conditions under which you work. Well, how long you work is intimately related to leisure, right? You work less long, you have more leisure. You work longer, you have less leisure. And so what's being said here is, if we look at it closely, that the combination of the package that you have, how long you work, how hard you work, the conditions under which you work, and your leisure is comparable for everybody, and your income. So in other words, if I look at my income, my leisure, my duration of work, my intensity of work, my onerousness of work, and I consider all of them, then we all have essentially an equal package. We don't necessarily earn the same amount, because I may work more. Cooper might want to work less hours for whatever reason. So he does. And I might want to work more hours. So I'm going to earn more than him. But notice he's going to get more leisure. And so I have the income, but that's offset by the leisure. So the question is right. Leisure is looked at as a positive, and a positive that we're giving up some of when we work longer, which is why you need an incentive to work longer and why you get remunerated for working longer.
I want to remind everybody here that any questions that we don't get to, Michael or anyone else from Real Utopia will be happy to answer any leftover questions in email format. So, feel free to fire away. We have one that just came in. So we have till 7:45, I believe. So we'll have a good amount of the time for questions about Paracon, and then we'll transition over to questions about Real Utopia before we wrap up. So we have another question that just came in about automation. So it says, would automation of onerous tasks inevitably become a high priority in relation to the way higher demand, i.e. way higher demand than existing technology would allow in a participatory economic system?
Yeah, what happens is you have a balanced job complex. So what does that mean? That means we all have an interest in the quality of work improving, because we're getting the average in essence, right? So if we're getting the average, we want the quality of work to improve for everyone. If I'm a selfish bastard and I only care about myself and I want my quality of work to improve, I have to be for improving the balanced job complex. If I want my income to improve, I can maybe work a little longer, or I can work a little harder, but I can also improve the overall output, and then we all benefit. So, yeah, the criteria for investment now becomes not making more profit for an owner, which is what it is now, and maintaining the conditions of control. So, for instance, it isn't obvious at all that assembly lines were primarily an investment that was made for the purpose of increasing profits. It's, in fact, I think, far likelier that assembly lines became prevalent because they had a very powerful effect on disempowering workers. And so what you're doing is not increasing the output and the price of the output and so on. You're reducing the power of workers. And so the same thing is true for what's the word? What's the word? Innovation. No, it's Christ. I'm looking for it in the question. I don't see it. Well, anyway, so the criteria for investment is, in fact, like the criteria for virtually everything, the benefit and the well-being and the development of people. And one of the well-beings of people is to reduce the amount of onerous work. So investment is going to go more to reducing the amount of onerous work. For example, if there's a choice between an investment that improves the speed and ease with which it's possible to do publishing, and there's another investment which goes on in, I hate to use coal mines as an example, but it's the first thing that comes to mind because we hope there won't be any coal mining, but any kind of really difficult circumstance, it's the latter that's in everyone's interest, right? It isn't just in the interest of the people in, let's say, the coal mine for the sake of the discussion, as compared to the people in the publishing house. It's rather that everybody has an interest in innovations that improve the average job complex, which then yields benefits for everyone. Participatory economics has the lovely attribute that it doesn't just replace markets. It replaces the competitive dynamics that markets introduce, in which one person's advance is another person's loss. Rather, we have an interest in social advance, and it's literally intrinsically built into the system.
Let's switch over a little bit to something that implicates both Paracon and real utopia. Somebody asked, can you explain, as one example, how favoring equitable remuneration would be relevant to a minimum wage campaign? If Alexandra, you want to start with that one?
Sure. That's a great question, and it leads right back into, well, strategy. That's why. We have vision, which is equitable remuneration. We value equity. So why should we value a minimum wage campaign? Because this is a step on the road that gets us closer to the value we say we want to apply to our economy. Not just that, but if you say you go to you strike and demand a minimum wage and you succeed, okay, great. But then if you just go home, you've done nothing to prevent a backslide in the future, or like has happened in the United States, the economy to carry on growing, but your wages not to keep on growing to keep up with it. So if you don't have vision to guide you towards more and more gains, we don't consider a minimum wage to be enough to satisfy our value of equity. It's a good step on the road to get there, but you need this vision both to prevent backslide for when you do have a victory, and to keep you going and fighting for what you actually want, and not just going home after one battle is won, but you didn't really get any systemic change.
Michael, you want to jump in too?
Yeah, let's make it very concrete. I agree completely with what you said, Alexandria. I mean, I think that's... imagine, let's put it on a campus. Imagine there's a fight on a campus by the custodial staff for a minimum wage of $15. And so there's a discussion and there's demands, and let's say the students support the fight. And so now you can imagine various kinds of actions and activities that are trying to win this. But in the course of doing that, what are you talking about? Well, you could be talking about $15 an hour as the goal and the ultimate goal. And then I think what you described being a possible debit, Alexandria, happens. You win it and you go home. You could instead be describing it in the way you did, which is it's a step on the road to something better, and you explain what the something better is, and you discuss the something better, and all of a sudden people are asking, how come the custodians are earning less than the professors? Because they shouldn't be. That is, the custodians are doing work in all likelihood for more hours, more intensely, and under worse conditions and more onerous. And if you believe in the norm that we have, that means when if we had these two jobs, we wouldn't, because we would have balanced job complexes. But if we did, the custodians would earn more. And to have a campaign like that in which you're simultaneously committed to winning the goal, $15 an hour, but simultaneously talking about the long run and raising consciousness so that it desires the long run and it understands the long run, and then it comes back and demands $25 an hour. And then the next thing it demands is that we reevaluate all income across the campus for, worthy remunerative norms. And the same applies to other issues that you can think of.
We have a question that popped up in the chat, not in the Q&A, so I'm just kind of going through some of these right now. We have one that I think is addressed, that could be addressed to both of you. It says, we are still dealing with colonized social conditioning. It's baked into our world, our system, all of us individuals. So isn't all of this just trying to lay a new plan on an old foundation with the naysayers, which is just another aspect of colonization to maintain the hierarchies, the dominance, and the control?
You want to say something, or you want me to?
To unmute, sorry. Sure, I can jump in. Dr. Perkins, I'm not 100% sure I understand the full extent of the question, but I'm going to take a stab at it as I understand it now, which is a concern over systemic injustices that are, as you say, baked into our world. They've been around for quite a long time, and they're not going to be easy to shake. So is this plan putting something new on an old foundation? I would say the opposite. That's the point of this. If you can get your hands on a copy of No Bosses, the way the book is actually laid out in describing this stuff is really helpful, in that it asks you to question everything that goes on in a current capitalist economy, and then even compared to socialist economies. So we're not just accepting old systems and even old foundations. We're questioning things down to the very basics. Like, what do we mean when we say equitable remuneration? What do we mean when we say diversity is a value? What do we even mean about solidarity, self-management, down the list? So to me, why I gravitate towards participatory theory and vision is what I think your question was getting at. It addresses just that. We can't lay new ideas on old things that aren't working. You can't put makeup on a pig, as they say. So for me, my answer would be no. Participatory economics does not do that, and that's why I advocate it.
Michael, go ahead.
I'm not entirely sure what you mean either, but I'll go with you this much, the questioner that is. We're all born and brought up, and in my case, having it baked in for 75 years, 74 years. So that's true. And what does that mean? Well, it's similar to, you could ask it about, say, men who have sexism for their lives, or depending upon the society, say whites who have racism. It should make us a little suspicious. I agree with you. So in other words, when you get a book like No Bosses, or you get somebody spouting off a vision for whatever, and they're a product of the old society, or they're even a product of and a beneficiary of elements of the old society, say sexism or racism or whatever, then there is the possibility that what they're proposing embodies, much to their distaste, they don't want to do it, but it embodies residues of the old society and would reproduce it. So you have to read it and decide for yourself. I agree with Alexandria that in this particular case, it's a pretty strong job of finding the roots of the things that are baked in: class division, hierarchy, authoritarianism, and so on. Finding the roots of those things, at least in the economy, and we need to do it in other domains as well, and then proposing an alternative which simply doesn't have those attributes. And in fact, it goes further. It has the opposite attributes. So it produces solidarity. It doesn't just destroy it. It doesn't just not destroy it. It produces equity. It doesn't just not destroy gargantuan income differentials, right? It actually produces the things that we desire. And in that sense, I think it doesn't represent a sort of a new form of the old pain and suffering. But you have to decide for yourself. But unless you're so willing to bet on that being the result that you don't have to look, in that case, there's no hope for any vision, because anybody would be so sure of that view that there could be none, and it's basically a prescription for stasis. In short, I don't take this wrong, please, but your question is a sort of a manifestation of what you're asking about. At least as I read it, because your question is basically saying, look, there's no way out, which is, of course, ratifying and reproducing the old system. That's not what we're doing. I hope that doesn't stifle questioning.
I want to clear something up. So we had gotten a question from Tom. It was the leisure question.
Yes.
I have no idea how this system works. I saw someone pop in to the session, and I did not know that that was something that was a feature of this. So, Tom, I apologize. This was not intentional in any way. I recommend now that we circle back to this question, and Tom, you can clear up any misunderstanding that Micheal may have interpreted, because it says that he confessed he did not understand, and then you were not satisfied with the answer. So, Tom, if you want to come in here briefly to ask this question, you are more than welcome. That should have worked.
Okay, here I am. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes,
We
you're
can
on.
hear you.
Yeah, hi. Yeah, I've done a lot of work on, well, a pamphlet from the 1820s. It's 200 years old, The Source and Remedy of National Difficulties. Its influence on Marx, and also the work of William Godwin. And what I find from that is really that the idea of leisure, as expressed by Godwin, and then disposable time, as expressed in the 1821 pamphlet, were really formative to Marx's analysis and critique of political economy. And somehow, I mean, the basic idea was that leisure was the source of wealth. And what happens under capitalism is that the capitalist appropriates the disposable time of the workers, and this becomes alienated from the workers and becomes a force against them. And somehow, over the course of even in Marx's revisions going into Capital, this got turned around so that really, kind of elevating work to the most important question. When you get into Stalin and Stakhanovism, the more you work, the better communist you are. But the question, going back to Godwin and to Dilke, who is the author of the 1821 pamphlet, and to the Grundrisse of the early manuscripts of Marx, it's really disposable time. It's the leisure element that is the source of the wealth that then becomes, turned against the workers. And so, I would really argue that disposable time and leisure need to be really a core element, analytical element of getting rid of bosses. Thanks very much for this opportunity to let me give my. One of the things I wanted to do is also break down that fourth wall, because I was in another forum and basically heard fantastic presentations by people, and yet there was really no engagement with people out in the peanut gallery. So thanks very much for this opportunity.
Yeah, of course. Sorry about the mix-up earlier.
No problem.
Yeah, if Micheal, you want to respond?
Sure. Okay. First, about the peanut gallery. There was a joke in Russia that existed. I'm not going to remember it perfectly, but two guys are walking along, and one of them points up at a speaker that's on like a pole, a telephone pole, and says, "Isn't it incredible that we can hear Comrade Lenin talk to us?" And the other guy says, "Yeah, but can Comrade Lenin hear us?" And that's exactly what you just said. And it's not a small observation, actually. It's a big observation, and it has to do with the whole coordinator class, working class division. As to the leisure time thing, I know you're not going to like this, but I think it's sort of semantics. You have more leisure time if you work less. You have less leisure time if you work more. Marx didn't say, and you know, I can't stand arguing about what Marx said because I'm not a historian of ideas, or you know, it doesn't matter to me. What matters to me is what's true, what's the case. And it's certainly true that you know, labor time produces stuff that's valued by society, and in capitalism, what it produces in say a factory yields results that are worth more than what's paid out, and so there's a surplus, and the owner expropriates it as profit. In market socialism and centrally planned socialism, it's still the case that the work that's done produces stuff which is valued more than what's paid for it, and that surplus now is expropriated in considerable part, just like the capitalists did in considerable part, by the coordinator class. You know, valuing leisure time is something that we do not because somebody talked about it some way in 18 whatever it was 20, but because we value leisure time. Because in leisure time you do things that are enriching and fulfilling and that make life a little better. But the view that says that leisure is wonderful and work is horrible, that's one of your residues of the colonized world of the last speaker. That is to say, alienated labor, work for a boss, work that's dictated by others. Yeah, that's pretty horrible. Even if it's paid well, it's pretty horrible. And of course, if it's paid poorly, it's that much more horrible. But work that's under your control, work that's producing things that people need, work that is you contributing to society and expressing your capacities and fulfilling those capacities, that's not only not bad, it too is a part of life. It too is a positive part of life. And you can see it, I mean, Chomsky likes this example, you can see it. Auto workers can't stand work in the auto factory and then go home and on Saturday work in their garage on their car. And it's the same activity, or at least somewhat the same activity, but the difference is there's no boss. And the difference is the beneficiary is not, you know, some distant owner, and so on and so forth. And so alienated labor is horrible. Look, we can make the same thing true for leisure. Leisure is really good, except when it isn't. So in other words, leisure when there's nothing to do, leisure when all avenues for expressing your talents and your abilities and your desires and your cares for other people are crushed out of existence by a social system that warps itself so that those relationships are hard. Leisure can become pretty onerous too. And there's probably a lot of people who work to escape leisure, just like there are a lot of people who pursue leisure to escape work. And if we had both of them humane, we would eliminate the problems.
We have about, just so everyone's aware, we have about 20 more minutes, but we got one more question that came in. It asks, how does participatory economics tie into a universal human rights perspective, say the Universal Declaration of Human Rights?
Most of the rights, I can't quote them. Most of the rights under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights or many of them are fulfilled intrinsically, automatically. Some aren't by what we've said so far. So for instance, if you're disabled or for some reason you can't work in a participatory economy, you get a full income. And you also get, of course, as everybody does, free medical care and so on. So a large number of the things are dealt with directly. If anything isn't dealt with directly, it probably has to do with something beyond economy. And economy is not everything. I don't subscribe in any way at all to the notion that, well, if we get participatory economics, we're home free. We're not. And in fact, we won't even get participatory economics without paying attention to political relations and cultural relations and gender and sexual relations and so on. But if the question is, I guess the answer to the question is that I think that participatory economics and participatory society address universal rights and go further and facilitate and advance and promote the fulfillment and development that that kind of universal declaration is aimed at.
Go ahead, Alexandria.
I feel that was a pretty complete answer to the question. I would just add one more nuance, is that internationalism is another value within participatory economics. And that's not just because we think it's a good idea, but in fact, participatory economics and participatory society at large will again be the best version, strongest version of itself, the wider it's applied. So if I'm in a country with a participatory economy and my neighbor is in a capitalist economy, we're still going to have some tension and friction in how these economies interact with each other. That can be applied to polity, intercommunalism, the values that the institutions uphold are going to determine the behavior of the actors, whether it's countries or humans living under those institutions. Are going to be able to do. It's going to bound your behavior by those values. So I would just think that's one more important point in that. Yes, it does uphold universal human rights perspectives, and in fact, especially when you say universal, the wider you apply this, the more inclusive and more diverse, the better systemically this idea becomes.
All right. Looking at the questions here, we have answered all except for one. It's a question about, I believe it was Alexandria who had mentioned the Argentinian case study of whether it was participatory budgeting. I'm not quite sure what that case study was, but somebody's looking to learn more about that case study, and in particular, what literature one might recommend to learn more.
So I think that was actually Michael's example of visiting the Argentine factory that had been taken over from the owners. So I will let him follow up on that.
Well, I'll tell another story from it. I don't know specific book references. There are articles, and I've written some stuff. But I'll tell you another story, which, so workers took over factories. And that means that people who were working class in their upbringing, but also doing working class jobs, some of them filled slots that were all coordinator slots. So I was in one of those places, and I was talking to a woman who had been a subordinate and was now handling the finances, doing the books and so on. And so I asked her what she had been doing before, and she said she had been working at a furnace, and I asked her to describe it, and she did. And basically, she was doing repetitive moves over and over again in front of a furnace because it was a glass factory. And my reaction to it was that I would have lasted about 20 minutes. And she, of course, did it for years on end. But then the factory was taken over. And when people asked, who's going to handle the books, she raised her hand for whatever reason. And so I asked her, what was the hardest thing in going from, doing this rote, disempowering activity to doing the financial books and the finances of this glass factory? She didn't really want to say. And so I pushed a little and I said, was it learning accounting concepts? No. Was it learning how to use spreadsheets? No. And now I'm beginning to run into a little trouble trying to think about what it was. Was it being able to talk about the no? So I said, all right, you got to tell me, what was it? And she said to me, first I had to learn to read. So she didn't just go from being working class, and she didn't just go from working at an open hearth furnace. She was also illiterate. And now she was doing the job of the accountant of the old firm. Of course, the old firm was failing and falling apart, and the new factory was succeeding. So some of you may have heard the description. I guess we didn't give a very large description of balanced job complexes, but the idea is sharing in tasks in such a way that each person is doing a mix of tasks of comparable empowerment. And so that means that somebody who's doing all empowering work in the current society would not be doing that anymore. They would be doing a mix of tasks that would include some of that and some that were disempowering. And it would also have to mean that some people who were doing disempowering work were doing empowering work. And so if, for example, the bookkeepers, the accountants, and the doctors and the lawyers are doing, let's say, 20% less, or let's make it even 50% less of the empowering activity, where is that empowering activity going to come from? So Margaret Thatcher is right. There is no alternative if it's not going to come from anywhere, if there is no source for that, if the people who aren't doing empowering work can't do empowering work. So the story is to show that that's just a complete and total lie. That's like what was said when it was said that women couldn't do, anything outside the household, or that blacks couldn't do any empowering tasks. That was all a lie. We now know it's a lie. We can see it's a lie. But it's true for working people also. So in other words, the relative lack of confidence, lack of skills of a particular sort, of a decision-making sort, lack of connections to others, lack of practice at it, et cetera, that people display, like what women displayed 50 years ago, or blacks displayed 50 years ago, those attributes, they're not wired in. That's not genetics. That's a social system which produces those outcomes, a school system which educates 20% to be the masters of the universe and 80% to endure boredom and take orders. And that's what our school systems do. And so participatory economics has tremendous implications all over the place. You can't have participatory economics in current school systems. Why? Because 80% would arrive in the factories and in the workplaces of all different sorts, unequipped and disinclined, right, by their experiences to play the role that they're supposed to play, that is, as full participants and as self-managing actors. So education has to change. And likewise, you can't have 20% thinking that they own the planet and that what they say goes. That doesn't work either. So they have to experience something different. So you can see how the impact of the economy manifests itself and reaches out into society, causing various kinds of ripple effects on other parts of society. And one thing that Real Utopia notices is that the same is true for the other domains. So transforming kinship, transforming the roots of sexism, transforming the roots of racism, transforming the authoritarianism of the political system, that also manifests outward, including into the economy, changing throughout society. So that's what a revolution is. A revolution is changing all the defining institutions. It's getting rid of the old crap that causes the divisions among people, the hierarchies among people, the injustices, the indignities, and replacing it with new institutions which literally produce the opposite.
As we're getting close to the end here, Micheal, I have a twofold question for you. So this is not your first time introducing participatory economics or writing about it or speaking about it or debating it or whatever. So the first part of this question is, with this new book, what are your goals for writing this new book? What are you hoping will come of it? And two, why might somebody not like No Bosses? Why would they not like participatory economics at large?
Well, my goal for it, I think it's like some things, success is entertaining, or success is just attracting, right? So for instance, some people, you look at the bestseller list, right? So some people's goal is to be number one. I mean, I'm not going to be, but some people's goal would be to be number one on the bestseller list. But with a book like no bosses, even if it was going to sell that widely, and maybe someday it will, right? Even if it's going to sell that widely, that's not an indication of success. An indication of success is whether or not the arguments and the evidence and the ideas and the ways of thinking impact people in such a way that there emerges, or at least help in the process of a shared vision emerging, and then a shared vision orienting strategy so that a movement, a project begins to create a new world. So that's success. That's, you know, for myself, everything I do, that's the metric. Is it contributing to that process or is it not? As far as why people might not like it, well, there's two different questions here. Why might they not like it before reading it, right? In other words, why might they have such a resistance to it that they don't even want to read it? They you know, dismiss it. And why might they not like it if they do read it? When Margaret Thatcher said there is no alternative, right? For those, I'm not sure everybody knows, but Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister of Britain, and you know, she said there is no alternative, meaning there's nothing other than capitalism. She was gleeful about it. And if you think about it, that's sort of like somebody saying there's no alternative to cancer, or there's no alternative to old age, and being gleeful about it, right? If she had said there's no alternative and was weeping, I would have thought, okay, she believes it for reasons of, I would hope she's wrong, but for reasons of having thought about it. But since she was gleeful about it, you can bet that she was saying it for the same reason that oppressors have been saying it for hundreds of years. There is no alternative is designed to get you to stop trying to think through an alternative and fight for one. So one reason why people might not read it is because, not even want to read it, is because they don't want to hear about an alternative. Either because they're benefiting greatly now, that's one possibility, or because they've taken in at some deep level the notion that you can't win. And if you really can't win, then hearing about something much better is really just annoying, right? It's sort of annoying. It's like dangling you know. So either one of those reasons could prevent somebody from even wanting to look at it. If you do look at it, why might you not like it? Well, you know, mundane things. You might not like the writing or whatever. On a larger scale, I think people who look at it and think about it and are not defending a set of interests, right? So they're not owners, might not like it because they don't like the idea of balanced job complexes and the fact that they're not going to be able to do only empowering work, which they might feel they're on track to do, or they are doing, or they want their kids to do. And that's defending class interests, right? And they might not like it because of more legitimate reasons, that they think that the planning system, the participatory planning system wouldn't work, or the remunerative norm wouldn't properly incentivize people, or the self-management would lead to bad decisions. All these kinds of things are dealt with in the book. If they read the book and they find those arguments unconvincing, then they won't like it. But they won't be gleeful, right? They won't like it, and they should try to do better if they really think that. It's the people who don't like it and are gleeful, right? Like Margaret Thatcher was gleeful. That's the perspective that is not pretty. Wait, let me just add one word. That's the perspective of the pharmaceutical companies, right? Gleeful over the profits that they're reaping. It's the perspective of basically the ruling class, now these are the owners, gleeful over the profits that they're reaping in the midst of a pandemic. The murder it's not just a disease, it's murder when the deaths are a function of the sequestering of vaccines to the first world. It's just murder. It's no different than flying planes over and just killing people randomly, because it's going to kill people randomly and large numbers preventable, and not prevented because these companies in a market system with private ownership are driven by the institutional relations and by their whole history of having done it. So to justify themselves, they keep doing it. And the behavior is murder on a grand scale.
Alexandria, I saw you were going to chime in there, but I want to pitch a question to you in addition to whatever you wanted to say, because I noticed we have 5 minutes. And we do have one question, which is on the iteration facilitation board. So Micheal, if you want to answer that in email, we can set that up. But Alexandria, I wanted to get your take on, the importance of vision-based strategy and what RU is trying to do, because it seems like we have no time, and it seems like, thinking about vision may seem far out and may seem impractical. So I was just curious to get your take about why it's so important in a time like this.
Sure. Well, my follow-up to Michael's comments about why someone might not like No Bosses or PariCon in general kind of leads into this. That's exactly why a network like Real Utopia is important, both for when people don't like it, or maybe they like a lot of it and they're confused or not convinced about an aspect of it, or have thoughts on ways to improve it. We need to come together and talk about these ideas, experiment with them, and refine them. And we can do that. Cooper, this leads into your question of how do we get from vision to strategy when we're living in a world literally on fire? We can start doing that right now. Like some of the examples I gave, if you're involved in any kind of organization, whether it's a business or a social group, a family, you can try to look at these values, and if you think, yeah, I like that, try and implement systems in your own life and in groups that you're involved in that uphold these values instead of decimate them. And you don't have to reinvent the wheel. There's lots of people who have been thinking about this for decades, and there's lots more people who've just recently started thinking about it. So what Real Utopia is trying to do is just be a place where we can find each other, and then the organization itself is already, it's non-hierarchical. So whoever joins has a say in what the organization does, how it operates. So we're all self-determining together how we can implement these values today. And then the last thing I'll just repeat, I've said it already, is that vision is a key element of strategy, because we can't just go from one battle to the next. We will become exhausted, we will squabble, and more often than not, we will fail over the long term. And if and when we do have a victory, we will be susceptible to backslide. So we need clear vision. We need to be unafraid to talk about it and actually believe we can attain it, so that we can continuously use tactics to go from battle to battle in a strategic arc that actually progresses towards the world that we want to live in over the long run.
Beautifully said. This is perfect timing. It's 7:44. So our panel ends at 7:45. By the way. Well, I want to thank first and foremost Alexandria and Micheal for being with us and for doing such a great job at fielding questions and proposing and presenting Participatory Economics, No Bosses, and Real Utopia. If you look earlier in the chat, Alexandria can drop them back in. We have the website for Micheal's new book, which is at nobossesbook.com. And we also have Real Utopia at realutopia.org. Those should be coming down in the chat promptly. And like I said, if you had any other questions, they can be answered via email by any of us in a pretty prompt manner. So I want to thank, of course, the Global Forum on Democratizing Work, all the organizers. This was an honor and this was a privilege to be a part of. And I want to thank our moderator, Lania, if you're still there. Thank you for doing all you were doing, making sure this is staying afloat. yeah, so those, take those links, and that's how you can further the learning on this, and obviously involvement via Real Utopia. You two want to say farewell?
Farewell.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.